Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Edward Linenthal on remembering the past. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and I'm pleased to welcome a guest into the studio here every week to talk about some important topic on the global agenda. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome a historian, Edward Linenthal, who's professor of history at Indiana University Bloomington, as well as the editor of the Journal of American History, so a very prominent journal in the field. Welcome.
Thank you, David.
And today we'll talk a bit about the past and remembering the past, and of course, the past is always with us. I've just finished teaching a course, first year course on social and political attitudes towards wars. So what you're here to talk about today is exactly the kind of thing I've been focusing on with my own students all term. And it's a fascinating subject.
Good.
So let's start just by letting you tell us a bit about how you got to this topic and where the interest came from and where you've taken it.
Sure, yeah, it's been a wonderful ride all these years. I did my dissertation. I was in Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I did my dissertation on the warrior as a religious figure in America. And as I was playing with all this stuff, was really interested in how battlefields figured into these stories as very important rituals. What are the formulaics that are used? Who's in? Who's out? What are the different messages that come out of these things? Memorial uses, ideological uses, but it wasn't for the dissertation. It was something I sort of put away as a project. And when I left Santa Barbara in '79 to go to the University of Wisconsin in Oshkosh, where I was for 25 years, I knew that I wanted to write a book which eventually turned into the title of it was Sacred Ground, Americans and Their Battlefields. And so I looked at processes of veneration, defilement, and redefinition at Lexington and Concord, the Alamo, Gettysburg, Little Bighorn, and Pearl Harbor. So lots of traveling and lots of wonderful places that all of whom had always grabbed me.
Right. Now, most people don't normally think of warriors as religious figures, at least not in the modern era. So when you use that word, how do you think of it? And you must mean something very specific.
Well, in traditional societies, and I would argue throughout history, both in East and West, warriors, after all, in war are responsible for giving and taking life. They shed blood, they take blood. Blood is a religious symbol par excellence. Warriors are cultural models, are cultural heroes. So it's not a hard case to make.
And do you have any sort of worshipful element involved in your thinking here? For example, do Americans worship their military heroes or not?
I don't think they worship them. Although you can certainly see attitudes of veneration towards someone like Custer, for example, with groups, very interesting groups of buffs and historians who have done very important work, the Little Bighorn Associates, for example. And people that go to these places go sometimes as tourists and sometimes as pilgrims, because this is, as the title of the book said, it is sacred ground. And by that I mean it is contested and it's powerfully symbolic and it's rich and pregnant with different kinds of meaning. It's ground unlike that surrounds it. The simple, although I don't think simplistic, definition that one of my colleagues, David Chittister, who's a wonderful cultural analyst, said, how do you know when somebody considers something sacred ground, for example, a place, is it's capable of being defiled? I mean, you can't defile a parking lot of a supermarket, but you can defile Gettysburg in all kinds of different ways, both ideologically and physically, in terms of desecration and defilement. So I looked at all of these places, and it was a wonderful, wonderful project to do. And that began a very long and, for me, wonderfully important relationship with the National Park Service. So I did a lot of consulting on how to interpret controversial historic sites. For several years in the 90s, I was a half-time visiting scholar in their civic engagement program doing seminars. So after Sacred Ground was done, I had the opportunity, I've been really blessed with these opportunities, to be literally the only historian that was allowed into the processes, people, stuff that went into the making of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So before the museum was built, I simply had access to everything and everyone. And I wrote a book called Preserving Memory, The Struggle to Create America's Holocaust Museum. And it's about, when you go to a museum, you see this finished product with the hidden authorial voice of curators, but you don't get a sense of the way you write a biography of a person. You go into the tensions and contradictions and surges and plunges in their life, and this is what I did with this place. Why should there be a Holocaust museum in the United States? Where should it be? What should the architecture look like? Is there a hierarchy of victims? Are Jews at the center and then everyone else sort of in peripheral? And these hierarchical questions are really important. What does a permanent exhibition look like? What kind of artifacts? What kind of photographs? Everything was a razor's edge issue. And it was, as part of it, as almost everybody at the museum did too, I went to Eastern Europe for 10 days. It's the only time I've been at some of the sites in Poland, and I'm sensitive to place, and so being at Auschwitz and Majdanek and some of these other places was very, very difficult. But I was really glad that I went. After that book was done, I won't bore you with all the details of how this happened, but I was asked to be on the original advisory committee for the ill-fated Enola Gay exhibition at the National Air and Space Museum, and eventually testified before a Senate committee, co-edited a book with Tom Engelhardt, one of the leading nonfiction editors in the country, called History Wars, the Enola Gay and Other Battles for the American Past. And it was a very difficult chapter. Tom made me rewrite it fully a couple of times because I felt really badly that I should have seen what was coming, and I didn't. And it was sort of one of the reasons I was on the committee. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and I talk about some of them in the book. But it brought home to me that the location of a museum, Los Alamos has had, I don't know if it's still there, but for years they had battling exhibit walls, or a peace group was allowed to come in to the museum at Los Alamos and do a critical exhibition on the dropping of the bomb, and then there was the more traditional. And these existed side by side for years, and no one went crazy.
Because nobody went there?
No, it's because people realized that this has been a contentious issue from that time forward.
But the Smithsonian, as I recall it, intended to show more than one side. Did they not?
Oh well,
originally,
what some people felt was that the Air and Space Museum had moved from, and museums have moved there along, progressive museums, from temple to forum, but that for some people this had moved to a tribunal, that they were in fact sort of putting the Enola Gay on trial. So it was very critical, but it was also, the largest part of the exhibition was on the Enola Gay itself, the plane itself and the technology and everything. Anyway, but the location of that museum, on the mall, at a time when American-Japanese tensions were rising, the significance of the traditional story of the Enola Gay in our history at the time of the anniversary made it a very, very volatile affair.
Right. Did you go to the Atomic Bomb Museum in Hiroshima, by the way?
No, I've never been. I have lots of friends that have been, and I've read about it, but I would love to go sometime.
Yeah. It's actually very political. They've taken the event and they've tried to turn it toward the future. And it's a very strong sort of anti-nuclear, almost pacifist take, in contrast to the museum in Nagasaki, which is very event-focused, and it's very human, and about what happened to the people here and the community here. Very different kinds of memories.
Interesting. Well, I sort of emerged from that, aware again of the volatility of the past, how the past comes alive. And of course, for many people, this was not past. This was something that was still, very, very present in their lives. I felt this as well. I was asked to do I worked for the National Park Service at the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then I went to deliver the commemorative address there in '94. And, to feel the intensity of the veterans, particularly as the generation, dies off,
Right.
was very, very moving. And it's a very, very moving place. When I finished History Wars, it had been a very intense, quite a number of years on these projects, and so I had young boys at home, and so I kind of made a promise that I wouldn't do any great big travel projects because I was commuting to all these places while I was teaching full time, which was 3 or 4 classes a semester for many years. So it was a go. But I got a call from a reporter at the New York Times, Joe Thomas, out of the blue one day. She wanted to talk about the Oklahoma City National Memorial, which it was the task force was just underway. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, obviously I knew about the bombing, but I hadn't followed the story about the memorial process.
Right.
And the more she told me, the more interested I got. And I called Bob Johnson, a wonderful, wonderful man, who a lawyer in Oklahoma City, who was the director of the, or chairman, I should say, of the Memorial Task Force, and said, "You don't know me, but I just talked to Joe Thomas, and boy, this sounds really interesting, and I love to write about these kinds of things." He says, "Oh, I know you very well because we've been reading Preserving Memory as a way to think about the difficulty of doing all this stuff." So one thing led to another, and in May of '97, so just a little over 2 years after the bombing, I started to go to Oklahoma City, and a book that originally was going to be simply, again, about memorialization process, became a much larger project in which I did a tremendous amount of oral history, and a lot of my heart will always be in Oklahoma City. Was a book about how an American city responds to an act of mass disaster. And it, in a kind of horrible irony, the book came out a week before 9/11.
Oh, wow.
So
that's amazing.
It got a lot of attention for really horrific reasons.
Right.
That was the last major book project that I did. Since then, I've served on the Federal Commission for the Flight 93 Memorial. I organized a 3-day trip for family members from Flight 93, members of the community, and others who were involved in the memorialization. We spent an absolutely stunning 3 days at the Oklahoma City National Memorial, and I had arranged for a number of survivors, people who worked at the memorial, family members to come, and it was, I don't think I'll ever write about it, but it was, you can imagine, to bring these two groups of people together was really quite stunning. And then last year and this coming year, I've had the honor of co-directing a Gilder Lehrman seminar on 9/11 and American memory at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City. And the only other writing project I've been involved with, it's been a wonderful project. I've co-edited with Christiane Gruber, an art historian who's a former colleague of mine at Indiana, now at U of M, and Jonathan Hyman, who's a brilliant photographer. Jonathan took 20,000 photographs of 9/11 memorials, body art of firefighters and other first responders, memorials of every kind. It's a breathtaking collection. And the University of Texas Press published a book that includes his photographs, my introduction, critical essays about the significance of his photographs, called Landscapes of 9/11, A Photographer's Journey. So it's just such a rich field to be working in, and of course, memory studies, for lack of a better word, has grown so much, in this time. But one of my friends, with whom I've been involved now in conversations with Norwegian colleagues on the memorialization of the terrorist attack in Oslo and on the island of Utøya in 2011, James Young, who writes brilliantly on Holocaust memorials. James characterized himself many years ago as a biographer of place, and that feels right to me.
Right.
So in a nutshell, that's sort of what I've been.
What a fascinating collection of projects.
Yeah,
And
they have
interesting
been.
in part because of the variation, I would think, tell me if I'm wrong, about the degree to which there are competing narratives. So Lexington and Concord, I visited that many times. I only really recall one narrative, and it strikes me as fairly mythical. I don't know how historically accurate it is, but one would think that Little Bighorn, that would be sort of settler colonial versus, progressive frontier expansion narrative.
Little Bighorn, it's so interesting because I think the best case study there is of how the National Park Service, custodian of so many of our treasured sites, had to transform because of the changing nature of the U.S. a shrine to George Armstrong Custer to a historic site.
Right.
And what does that mean?
Building in the other side of the story.
Well, it means eventually, of course, you have now an Indian memorial that changes the physical landscape, but even before that, the museum there had previously been all about Custer. Well, I mean, Custer was a major figure.
Yeah.
He was a superstar of the culture, so of course he and the Seventh play a role in this. But there were other groups of Americans there that day as well. So how do you tell the story? From where do you tell the story? It's interesting that the visitor brochure underwent a sea change in the little kind of catchphrase that you take away. It all went from just focused totally on Custer in the Seventh to, and this is word for word, I don't know if it still is, but I suspect it is, one of the last armed efforts of the Northern Plains Indians to preserve their ancestral way of life. Now, what's really interesting is that such a change and represents this kind of new way of thinking about this. But I found that exact phrase in an old brochure many, 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 many years ago.
Is that
like
right?
in the 20s or 30s. And I've never been able to figure it out. And it's a good place also when I talk with students about, because when this stuff happens inevitably, I mean, this happened with the Enola Gay, it happens with every people, that you're rewriting history, or you're revising history. And we've done a horrible, we historians, revisionist history becomes public shorthand for people making stuff up and lying and changing things for ideological purposes. Well, of course people do that, but that's not revisionist history. That's bad history. The second historian was the first revisionist. It would
Right.
you wouldn't want your daughter, I don't think, if she was in a class on the Holocaust, to have her professor come and say, the files in the Soviet Union and the Ukraine and Belarus have opened up now with the sea change that's gone on. And so if I were to go there and study in these files, we would be able to rewrite and revisit and do so much new stuff in terms of teaching you and writing about the Holocaust. But doggone it, I'd have to revise my understanding, and that would make me a revisionist. So I'm not going to do that. I mean, this is dopey. There's no other area of life. I mean, you don't recoil in horror when one goes to the doctor and they don't put leeches on you.
Right.
So of course historians revise. I mean, you'd have to be intellectually senile not to. What happens at so many of these places, and this was certainly true at the Little Bighorn, there is an original interpretation. Custer and his men died a Christ-like death to open the American West for Anglo civilization, and the power of that civilization brought skilled, albeit barbaric, enemies, Native Americans, to ways, as one person said on the 50th anniversary, ways of pleasantness. So that narrative, unchallenged for so long, becomes natural.
Yes.
It's not an interpretation anymore. It's it.
It's the anchor.
It's standard. It's the truth. So any way to get at that, to say, well, there are other vantage points from which to look at Little Bighorn, are going to be met with that kind of recoil. But the Park Service did it, and this is part of the challenge. It's not going from Errol Flynn, the mythic Custer, to the martial megalomaniac in Little Big Man. I mean, that's just the reverse, silliness at the other end. It's looking at Custer in the Seventh and the Native Americans as historical actors in a larger panorama of Native American white relations on the plains in a battle that, for all its insignificance strategically, I don't know if this is still the case, David, but when I was writing Sacred Ground, I recall reading, and it was a legitimate source, although I couldn't for the life of you tell me what it is now. At that time, this is 80s, there had been more written about the Little Bighorn than any battle in the history of the world, including Waterloo, and more written about George Armstrong Custer than any military figure in the history of the world.
That's completely interesting. I've never known that.
Yeah.
Oh. Now, Gettysburg.
Gettysburg,
one of the
yes.
most impressive national parks I've ever been to, and one of the things that impressed me was how skillfully they presented both the North and the South perspectives, and were non-judgmental largely about the background politics issues. Just here's what happened, here's why it happened, and we're going to let you almost relive what happened in a very accurate way. And I wonder if that was a deliberate choice to help use the battlefield as a way of continuing the healing process and try not to have good guys, bad guys, which could have been very tempting.
Sure, and Civil War battlefields, at least the ones that the National Park Service control, have undergone a sea change as well, reintroducing in appropriate ways thinking, putting slavery as a central ideological element in the coming of the war. I mean, these armies were there for a reason.
Right.
This doesn't mean that all Southerners are fighting for slavery. It certainly doesn't mean that Northerners were all fighting to abolish slavery. Of course not. But slavery is at the heart of so much of this. The battlefields, many of them used to promote an ideology of reconciliation, which was an interesting and charged ideology itself because it completely erased African Americans from the story. As if these battles, the significance was to show the martial heroism of white American North and South.
Right.
And that's what the war had been about, sort of arcane states' rights issues, and African Americans weren't part of this at all. This has undergone a tremendous change, not because historians are now coming and doing all kinds of wild new interpretive stuff. We're using the words of people who were there at the time. A great example of this in a book is a book by Margaret Creighton, who's at Bates College, called The Colors of Courage. And it's about ethnic conflict in the Union Army at Gettysburg, Germans and Irish at each other's throats. It's about the free African American community in Gettysburg who were terrified, and many of them left, because the Army of Northern Virginia was selling free blacks into slavery as they came through Pennsylvania. And it's about the women's experience in Gettysburg. The forgotten...
Right. I don't recall that in the presentation, but maybe I wasn't paying attention.
These women lived in a landscape that had become a horrific other world.
Right.
Thousands of dead horses. I mean, we had, hundreds of thousands of men and horses on this battlefield. They were all going to the bathroom. Think of what that place smelled like.
Yeah.
The sensory assaults. So one of the problems with these places is people will go to see battle reenactment, but the Park Service, I don't know if they tried it again, but once they tried to do a presentation of a field hospital and had obviously not real ones, but arms and legs, and people are saying, "Oh my, you're upsetting my child." No, you can't show that. So to show war is kind of fun and games or anything, but to show it in its brutality is somehow not. So there are all kinds of challenges at these places. And another challenge is Gettysburg, the Park Service freezes the field as much as they can to look like it did those July days in 1863. So it's an interesting question for all of us. Why do we think, and I'm glad they do, but why do we think we need a frozen environment from which to do our remembering? What would be wrong with letting Gettysburg or Auschwitz, where the barracks are now preserved, what about letting them just go into ruins to emphasize how time moves on. What if Gettysburg was just allowed to be Gettysburg now? It's an interesting question, isn't it?
I see both sides of it, actually.
Yeah, me too. Oh, yeah, me
Yeah.
too. The Alamo, there was a fantastic. The Alamo, of course, has a long history before the drama of The Last Stand. It was one of the missions of San Antonio. So finally, I think sometime in the 1980s or 1990s, I can't remember off the top of my head the date, but the Alamo had never been included on the tour of of San Antonio missions as a mission. But finally, a presentation was done at the Alamo about its life as a mission without ever mentioning the battle. I think that's a wonderful way
yes.
of
Right.
shifting focus, and shifting lenses. Think of the shift in focus when you enter the big house, a plantation. You enter it from the back door and go in through the kitchen. And you think about the enslaved people who worked there, not the furniture and the drapes and all of that. It's a way of repositioning ourselves to enrich our understanding in this sort of kaleidoscope of historical representation.
Now, I wouldn't imagine there'd be a competing narratives thing happening in Oklahoma City, is there?
No, there are a number of different narratives in Oklahoma City, and these actually made up several of the chapters in the book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my lecture tonight. But there's a narrative of civic renewal. Yes, it was horrible, but this gives us the opportunity to refurbish a city, to come together. Everyone's blood was the same that day. So, the event trumps race, it trumps class, it trumps all of that. There's always a kind of collective effervescence after tragedy, as if you reach this kind of social high that you think can be enduring and lasting, and it never is, but it's there. There was a narrative of religious redemption as people mobilized religious resources of all kinds to engage the problem of evil, to try and create a framework of meaning, for events that are so destructive of meaning systems. There was a toxic narrative, and in many ways, that's what the title of my book is meant to be, the unfinished bombing, Oklahoma City in American memory. That the bomb, as all of these kinds of events, lives on in so many ways in the bodies and minds and spirits of people. And then there was one of the most troubling narratives for me, the therapeutic narrative. And this is such a dominant narrative in our culture that here were people, and this happens all over, victims of political terrorism who are being considered patients who are ill. So their narratives are being turned into illness narratives. And one of the psychiatrists in Oklahoma City who was very uncomfortable with this said to me, people inhabit the diagnoses they're given. And there were people who really rebelled against this and turned to the arts to express their anger, their search for meaning, their mourning. They turned to poetry and to dance and to writing and all of that. But they did not turn to necessarily therapists, the sort of grief industry. We're the new high priests, so we'll unlock the key to your illness narratives for you. So this was a very interesting story that
is fascinating.
Was part of this, and what was very interesting to me is in Oklahoma City, called the Buckle of the Bible Belt, while religious responses were very strong, the therapeutic narrative dominated.
Wow.
The language, the horrible language of closure and healing process, as if grief has a kind of term limit, and that if you grieve too long, you're obviously sick.
Yeah, right.
And that healing is a regular process that you can chart. This is the dopiest stuff there is. you know.
We just have a minute left. I
Yeah.
wish we could go on forever, but in the last little bit, I'd just like to ask you quickly, you've mentioned a number of different projects you've been involved in, and some are physical sites where things happened. Holocaust Museum, Holocaust didn't happen in Washington, but there is a...
Right.
And what do you think are interestingly different or similar about those? And can you get the same thing out of even, say, utterly virtual forms of memory, such as Ken Burns' series on the Civil War, which used photography, or the Vietnam Memorial, right, which is not in Vietnam, but very consciously designed to communicate a certain attitude or toward the entire Vietnam experience?
I have students in my Holocaust and American Memory class I give them a number of sites of Holocaust museums around the world, and they have to go and look at how differently the Holocaust is presented in these.
Yeah.
So I think it's wonderful to be able to touch these sites. I'm probably old-fashioned, since I'm old. I still think being physically at a place, touching it,
Is a special
smelling it, breathing it, hearing it, is unlike anything. But how wonderful that we can take virtual tours. I think it enriches our lives, because none of us can go to all the places we want to go to.
Right. The Vietnam Memorial, as I mentioned at the end, is one of my personal favorites for a couple of reasons. One is every time I've been there, people are kneeling at the wall and they're touching the wall, the names of their fallen friends and comrades, and they're usually crying. So it's very powerful emotionally.
Yeah.
But the first time I went there, I walked down the grade, and the whole thing, as you know, our audience may know as well, it's giant black polished granite with the names of every American who died in the war on it, and that's it. And I walked down the slope, and I turned to the right, and the very first name I saw on the wall was David Welch. And that was a stunning experience.
Wow.
I actually looked up this fellow. There's a database, of course, available publicly of every American who died. So I even know who this person is, where he was born,
amazing.
the circumstances under which he died.
Oh, my
This is a
goodness.
very effective way of communicating sort of the personal
Well, and
tragedy of war.
I think the modern focus on names, faces, and stories is a way that we protest the anonymity of mass death in the modern time. And Maya Lin's memorial changed American forms of memorialization in all kinds of wonderful ways. And I think in some not wonderful ways too, because I think I'm probably an outlier, but I think everyone who's come on the mall after Maya Lin wants to try and trump Maya Lin. Bigger, better, more unique, more different, and I don't think they've come close.
Well, completely fascinating subject, and thank you for coming and talking
my
with us
pleasure.
about it. As I say, I wish we could keep going, but we're out of time, and to the audience, thank you for joining us, and please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.